The city never slept, but tucked inside its restless heart was an old Italian restaurant that most of New York's elite had long forgotten. The kind with creaking chairs, candlelit tables, and servers who worked late into the night for tips folded in half out of habit. For Isabella Diaz, that restaurant wasn't just her job, it was her battlefield, her classroom, and her exile all at once. Night after night, she carried trays heavy with plates, balanced smiles that weren't always real, and endured the sting of customers who thought waitress meant invisible. But Isabella wasn't invisible. Her eyes shimmered with quiet fire. Her dreams, though buried under exhaustion, still breathed. This wasn't her forever. This was the battlefield she'd endure until something bigger came along. She didn't know that something bigger would walk in on a winter night, dressed in a tailored suit, dripping wealth and indifference, ordering wine that cost more than her week's pay. His name, Adrien Blackwood. Adrien wasn't just rich, he was legend. His empire stretched across continents. From private jets to luxury hotels, Adrien Blackwood had cultivated the aura of the untouchable. Women whispered about him, tabloids drooled over him, businessmen feared him. Yet on that night, he sat alone at a corner table, his gaze sharp, restless, as though the empire in his pocket had failed to quiet something raging deeper within. Isabella approached with the same poise she gave every stranger, pad in hand, her black apron tied neatly around her waist. "Good evening. Can I get you started with anything other than the vintage Merlot you seem intent on judging?" Adrien blinked, startled. People usually bowed beneath his gaze, eager to impress, terrified to tease. But this waitress had just cracked the armor of his solitude with one sentence. "Are you always this forward with customers?" he asked, arching one perfect eyebrow. "Only with the ones who look like the wine glass is their only friend," Isabella replied calmly, scribbling notes. Adrien's lips curved ever so slightly. It wasn't a smile, at least not the kind the tabloids had catalogued. It was rarer, smaller, amusement that slipped past his iron sense of control. For the rest of the evening, Isabella served him with efficiency but without awe. She didn't linger in fawning silence the way women often did around him. She asked if he wanted more bread, rolled her eyes when he answered his phone during dinner, and treated him as if he were anyone else fighting through another cold night in the city. Fascinated him. The next night he returned. And the night after that. Always alone. Always at her table. He studied her movements, the way she navigated between guests without stumbling, the calm tenacity stitched into every polite smile. On the fourth night, Isabella leaned on his table briefly, her tone casual. "If you're planning to make this a habit, I'm warning you, I don't offer therapy sessions no matter how much you tip." Adrien smirked. "And yet, you seem determined to diagnose me anyway. Because money doesn't cure loneliness. And you wear loneliness like an expensive suit." That night Adrien left more than a tip. He left unsettled. No one spoke to him like that. Not rivals, not lovers, not even family. And the fact that a waitress, whose life existed far beneath the marble of his, could see him so clearly, that both irritated him and pulled at him in ways he didn't want to admit. For Isabella he was a curiosity. She'd served countless arrogant men parading wealth like weapons. Adrien was different, not because of his money but because of the sadness she glimpsed when he thought no one noticed. Behind the sharp suit, behind the aura of power, there was a fracture. And Isabella, against her better judgment, wanted to understand it. One night, after another long shift, Isabella stepped out into the frigid air, only to find Adrien leaning casually against a sleek black car parked at the curb. For a moment her breath caught, not because of awe but because of irritation. "If you're waiting for me," she said, arms crossed, "you're wasting your time. My shift is over and I don't serve drinks off the clock." Adrien chuckled softly, hands in his pockets. "You're different." "Different?" Isabella repeated. "You make it sound like a diagnosis. It's an observation. Most people bend around me. You don't?" She gave him one of her sideways smiles. "Maybe you're not worth bending for." His smirk faltered. In that instant he knew he was no longer in control of the conversation. And for Adrien Blackwood that was intoxicating. The relationship that followed didn't bloom like a fairy tale. It was battle and dance in equal measure, a slow fire crackling between a waitress who refused to bow and a millionaire unaccustomed to hearing no. Continued chance encounters turned into late-night conversations. Adrien tested her with invitations to glittering restaurants. Isabella countered with refusals, insisting that if he wanted to share a meal, he could try the diner around the corner. Adrien, to the shock of everyone around him, went. And when he sat in the cracked vinyl booth across from her, sipping cheap coffee, listening to her voice as she described her dreams beyond waiting tables, he felt something he hadn't in years: real. But reality wasn't without danger. Adrien's world was a fortress of wealth, and Isabella's, a battlefield of survival. To merge those worlds was to invite judgment, scandal, betrayal. And while Adrien was falling, slower than Isabella but undeniably, he had no idea she carried secrets of her own. Secrets that even she wasn't sure she'd ever confess. In the end, it wasn't the champagne dinners or flashy gestures that drew them closer. It was the truth, the ridiculous, stubborn truth, that a billionaire accustomed to obedience had met his match in a waitress who saw beyond the empire into the loneliness of the man behind it. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was only the beginning of a story that would shake both their worlds to the core. And to everyone watching from the sidelines, this wasn't just romance. It was unbelievability itself. The first rumors didn't begin in newspapers, they began inside the restaurant. By Adrien's sixth unannounced appearance at the shabby Italian place, Isabella's co-workers had started whispering. Cooks smirked, waitresses teased, and the manager pulled Isabella aside with thinly veiled suspicion. "Be careful," he warned. "Men like that don't show up for coffee. They show up for conquest." Isabella brushed it off with her signature composure. "Men like him have the whole city worshipping at their feet. If this is conquest, he's chosen the wrong battlefield." But even she couldn't deny his persistence was unusual. With each visit, Adrien peeled away one layer of disinterest and revealed another contradiction beneath. He spoke about markets toppling and investments rising the way most spoke about weather, but then he'd fall strangely quiet when Isabella looked at him too directly, like she was reading words written on his soul he didn't want uttered. One night, she found herself seated opposite him in that same cracked vinyl diner booth, watching him try to wrestle with a grilled cheese sandwich. "This isn't exactly five-star French dining," Isabella teased, smirking at his uncomfortable expression. Adrien smirked back, lowering the sandwich. "Well then maybe I needed a break from the 5 stars. Lately they feel like cages." "This?" He gestured vaguely at the neon lights and worn counter. "At least this feels alive." She blinked. It was the first confession that sounded less like Adrien Blackwood the Empire and more like Adrien the man. And it was in that moment Isabella realized she wasn't just entertaining him anymore. She was beginning to see him. Still, seeing was dangerous. Every time she stepped into his orbit, Isabella felt the weight of invisible eyes. The chauffeur who glanced at her with amused pity. The maitre d's at upscale restaurants with thin smiles that whispered, "She doesn't belong." The tabloids that thrived on photographs. The contrast between Adrien's world of excess and her world of tips was spectacle waiting to be crucified. "Why me?" she asked him bluntly one evening when he arrived at the restaurant just after closing, offering her a ride. She crossed her arms, standing her ground at the door instead of stepping into his sleek car. Adrien smiled faintly. "Because you're different. I'm also nobody in your world. That's the point. Everyone in my world treats me like a machine fueled by money. You're the only one who sees past it." For a dangerous, fleeting second, Isabella's chest dared to soften. But she quickly steadied herself. "Don't confuse curiosity with salvation, Adrien. I'm not here to fix you." And with that, she turned, walking into the night without his chauffeur, leaving Adrien staring after her, unsettled and unusually powerless. Power? That was the paradox of it all. Adrien had it everywhere but here. In boardrooms he devoured competitors. In ballrooms, women clung to his arm desperate to be noticed. But with Isabella, his power scattered like sand through glass. And that weakness was becoming an addiction. Soon Adrien broke his own rules. He began slipping away from obligations, delegating high-level meetings, skipping galas where his presence had always been expected. Instead, he spent his nights in small spaces with Isabella. At first, she resisted, brushing off his grand gestures, refusing his extravagant offers. But gradually she allowed fragments of her own story to surface. A father who'd left when she was young. A mother whose illness had swallowed what little savings they had. Months without rent before she took the waitress job to survive. She spoke without bitterness, without self-pity, Just simple truth delivered by a woman who had fought too hard to waste time on illusions. Adrien, for once, didn't interrupt with solutions or money. He listened. And in her raw honesty, something in him cracked. But honesty isn't harmless. It sharpens both admiration and fear. By the third month of their unlikely meetings, the newspapers caught on. The photograph was grainy, Adrien Blackwood walking into Isabella's diner in a suit worth more than the entire building, but it exploded online. Headlines followed. The Billionaire and the Waitress? Has Adrien Blackwood lost his mind, or found his heart? Adrien shrugged it off easily in public, smirking at reporters, offering no comment. But Isabella's life turned into wildfire overnight. Paparazzi waited outside her apartment. Customers began appearing at the restaurant just to mock her. Tabloids twisted her name into nightly punchlines. One evening, after a brutal day facing whispers and camera flashes, Isabella confronted Adrien in his penthouse, where she'd reluctantly agreed to meet him. She stood in his gleaming living room, walls of glass, marble floors polished into mirrors, and glared at the empire that suffocated her. "Do you have any idea what it's like to have strangers spit your name just because you looked at the wrong person's wineglass?" she demanded. Adrien, leaning casually against his bar, looked at her with rare softness. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Of course you didn't. You didn't mean for me to be chased home, or for my boss to threaten firing me, or for the world to laugh at the girl stupid enough to think a billionaire could ever love her." Her voice cracked slightly, but her eyes burned. In a way, it was the rawest Adrien had ever seen her. He crossed the room abruptly, lowering his voice to a bare whisper. "I do love you." Silence. Isabella recoiled slightly, her shock clear. Love was not the word she expected from a man like him. Not a word she trusted. And yet the ache in his voice was undeniable. "Prove it," she said finally, her jaw set. "Prove it's not lust. Prove it's not ego. Prove it's real. Because right now, Adrien, words mean less to me than the paper tabloids use to mock my name." Her challenge lingered in the glass-walled air. The empire builder had conquered markets, rivals, continents, but now his future hinged not on contracts or acquisitions. It hinged on proving his heart to a woman who had nothing but dignity. And Adrien realized with a chill, this might be the hardest conquest he had ever faced. Adrien Blackwood was used to challenges measured in billions. Mergers, hostile takeovers, oil contracts that decided international fates. But Isabella's challenge was the one thing he couldn't simply sign away or purchase. "Prove it." Those words gnawed at him like a fire in his lungs. In the days following, Adrien shifted gears. No longer did he arrive with flashy cars, no longer did he hold out rare perfumes, jewelry boxes, and designer handbags as proof of devotion. He tried those once, and she rejected them all with the casual shake of her head. "Love isn't a receipt, Adrien. Stop handing me transactions." So what then? How did a man who had been measured entirely by wealth prove his heart? The first attempt came quietly. Isabella finished her shift at the diner on a rainy Tuesday to find Adrien outside. No chauffeur, no umbrella, no glossy performance. Just him, standing under the drizzle, coat damp, waiting for her to finish. "You're ridiculous," she muttered when she saw him, crossing her arms. "You look like you've never stood in rain before." "Maybe I haven't," Adrien replied honestly, smiling faintly. "But I'd rather stand here than anywhere else." For a second, her defenses wavered. She said nothing, simply walked past him toward the subway. But she noticed he didn't complain about her choice of train over limousine. He took the ride with her, suit damp, hair dripping, as though no one had ever asked him to before. And sitting there, across from her on a rattling seat with flickering lights overhead, Adrien Blackwood looked less like an untouchable billionaire and more like a man trying. Still, trying wasn't enough. To Isabella, persistence had to be matched by reckoning. The following week, tabloids printed her photo again, this time at the market buying groceries. Headlines ridiculed her dress, her low-cost bag. At the diner, co-workers eyed her strangely, pity mixed with jealousy, until her manager finally said, "Customers are complaining about the press outside. I need to let you go." That night, Isabella stormed out of the restaurant, fury tearing through her. Outside, Adrien's sleek car idled, waiting. When he stepped out, she faced him with fire in her eyes. "Because of you," she snapped, "I don't have a job. Do you understand me? The paparazzi don't care that my mother has doctor appointments I need money for. They don't care about tips. They care about whether the billionaire's plaything wears lip balm. Adrien stood still, hit by the force of her frustration. For once, words eluded him. He reached for her arm, but she stepped back. "You don't live in the real world, Adrien," she said bitterly. "But I do. And I've just been shoved out of it because of your presence." Her words shattered him. He drove home that night with rain pelting the windshield and a silence heavier than boardroom defeat. He realized he couldn't fix what fame stole from Isabella, not with money, not with his empire. But maybe, just maybe, he could give her something she didn't expect. Himself, willing to change in her world, not force her into his. So he tried again. He began showing up at the hospital wing where Isabella's mother went for her checkups, sliding quietly into waiting room chairs beside her instead of whisking her mother away in private luxury. Isabella at first glared, muttering, "You don't belong here." Adrien didn't flinch. "Then let me start belonging." Gradually, Isabella watched her mother, once skeptical, warm to him. He carried her bags, made awkward jokes, even fetched cafeteria sandwiches. For a woman who'd only seen his face on the covers of business magazines, Adrien Blackwood carrying tuna on rye was absurd enough to make her laugh. Isabella's heart resisted, but some small part softened watching him. Still, she wasn't ready. Late one evening, in the penthouse Adrien had begged her to visit again, Isabella stood against the glass wall overlooking glittering Manhattan. "Do you know why I can't just fall at your feet, Adrien?" she asked, her voice low. "Because you don't trust me," he answered. "Because I don't trust men who think conquering equals caring. My father left when I was young because we weren't easy enough. Every man since has wanted something. Do you get that? To me, you're not offering love, you're offering another price tag. Prove you're not." Adrien swallowed hard. "Tell me how." She looked directly at him, her eyes sharp. "Stop hiding behind your wealth. Show me who you are without it. Then maybe you'll have a chance." That night, Adrien lay awake with her challenge slicing through him. Who was he without the money? He had no answer, and that terrified him more than any lost merger ever had. The next week he pulled boundaries away from the empire. He took her to parks instead of penthouses, diners instead of Michelin stars. He showed up not in chauffeured cars but walking beside her in weather his assistants would have shielded him from. He let himself be laughed at, argued with, challenged. For the first time in decades, Adrien Blackwood wasn't building an image. He was just a man trying clumsily to earn a woman's truth. And Isabella, she began to notice. When he carried a peeling grocery bag from the corner bodega without complaining, when he knelt to help a child pick up spilled toys on the subway platform, when he laughed, not the charming practice smirk but a rough, real laugh, something shifted in her chest. Still, she told herself this might be performance. And performances always have endings. But late one night, walking her back to her modest apartment, Adrien stopped suddenly under a flickering streetlight. "If you never marry me, if you never even say you love me, I need you to know this, I'm already yours. Because you're the first person who's ever seen me, the me without glass walls and endless zeros." Isabella froze, her heart hammering. For the first time she didn't hear the billionaire speaking. She heard the man. And that scared her more than anything else, because it meant she might finally, against all her resistance, be falling. The higher they climbed toward something resembling closeness, the louder every voice around them screamed to tear it apart. By the fourth month of their entanglement, Adrien and Isabella's relationship wasn't just rumor, it was headline. Paparazzi swarmed Isabella's apartment not for fleeting curiosity anymore, but because the world had made her into a symbol, the waitress who caught an empire. Every morning, news anchors chuckled with cynicism. Is Adrien Blackwood serious, or is this just the billionaire's latest indulgence? Fashion bloggers dissected her plain clothes with cruelty. Financial analysts speculated if Adrien's sudden distraction meant weakness for Harrington-level mergers. Even customers at the grocery store whispered theatrically, as though standing near Isabella required commentary. No matter where she turned, Isabella was mocked, doubted, reduced. And for a woman who fought every day to hold on to dignity, it burned like acid. Adrien noticed the toll immediately. The Isabella who once met him with fire now walked faster in public, wrapped herself in oversized jackets and avoided eye contact. He hated it. Hated that his presence, his name, his wealth, which once wrapped him in protection, was suffocating her instead. One night, Adrien invited her to a charity gala, not the kind glittered with shallow cocktails, but one supporting a children's hospital. He thought it would show her the part of his world that mattered. Reluctantly she agreed. She arrived in a borrowed dress hemmed too short, looking breathtaking yet slightly uncomfortable, as cameras flashed like lightning when she walked beside him. Inside, the gala was opulent, chandeliers blazing, music weaving through gold-leafed halls. Adrien introduced her quietly to a few allies, but whispers shot like arrows through the room. That's her? She's really just a waitress? What will this do to the Blackwood name? Isabella endured it as long as she could, chin lifted high. But a group of socialites, dressed in gowns dripping more diamonds than most salaries, cornered her near the champagne table. So, one woman drawled with venom dressed as curiosity, how does it feel to go from serving cocktails to drinking them in crystal? Quite the promotion. Another chimed in, lips smirking. Tell us, do you plan to marry quickly before he notices you can't even pronounce half the bottle labels? Adrien appeared seconds later, his hands sliding protectively around Isabella's waist. His eyes burned cold. Careful, he said sharply. Insults say more about the speaker than the target. But Isabella had already stiffened, her cheeks hot not with humiliation, but anger. She excused herself almost instantly, walking out into the crisp night air, heels clicking furiously against marble. Adrien chased after her, finding her outside beside the valet. Isabella. Don't, she hissed, spinning around to face him. Her eyes glistened as fury burned behind them. Don't pretend this isn't your world. Those women are your world. They're the air you've breathed your whole life. And me? I'll always be the outsider they laugh at for sport. You think I care about them? Adrien snapped, his voice ragged. You care that they're right, Isabella shot back. Because someday you'll see me through their eyes and realize I'll never fit into your glass tower. The word struck him harder than any market collapse. He reached, desperate, but Isabella pulled away. Take me home. Not to your penthouse, to mine. The car ride was suffocatingly silent. Isabella's jaw was firm, her body tense. Adrien watched her from the corner of his vision, devoured by helplessness. He could buy diamonds, empires, countries, but he couldn't erase how the world mocked her just for holding his hand. When they arrived at her modest apartment, Isabella turned to him before stepping out. Her voice was quieter now but sharp as a blade. You keep saying you love me. If that's true, Adrien, then you need to prove it's worth the cost of walking away from everything that protects you. Because right now, all I see is a man surrounded by gold bars that are my prison. She shut the door before he could speak. That night, Adrien sat in the penthouse staring at his reflection. For the first time in years, the mirror didn't show the empire builder. It showed a man trapped by the very wealth he worshipped. And for the first time he hated it. The days that followed carved deeper divides. Isabella dodged his calls, focusing on caring for her mother, taking odd shifts at smaller cafes to cover gaps. Adrien ached quietly, smothered by headlines painting her as opportunist, him as reckless. His advisors pressed on him, urging, distance yourself. Marry an heiress. Save your image. But Adrien found himself at war, a war boardrooms never prepared him for, the war between empire and love. Finally, one evening he appeared on Isabella's street again. No limousine, no photographers trailing. He carried nothing but himself. She was sitting outside, exhausted after another long shift at her new cafe job, still in her apron. You could have stayed in your marble halls, she muttered as soon as she saw him. I don't want marble anymore, Adrien said simply. I want this. This? She let out a bitter laugh. This is exhaustion, bills, survival. You don't even know what this means because you've never lived it. Adrien knelt before her, an image absurd enough to make her blink. Adrien Blackwood, empire magnate, knees pressed to cracked pavement outside a cheap cafe. Then let me learn. Even if I stumble. Even if it ruins me. Let me learn, for you. The sincerity in his rough, raw voice pierced deeper than diamonds ever could. Isabella looked at him, then really looked, and saw the impossible. A man who had everything but was willing finally to lose it for a shot at love. She didn't forgive him then. Not entirely. Pain like hers didn't vanish overnight. But slowly her fire softened. She exhaled and whispered, You want to prove it? Then don't meet me as Adrien Blackwood, billionaire. Meet me as Adrien Man. The rest we'll see. That night, as Adrien walked away from her street, he felt no boardroom victory, no magazine triumph. But he felt something rarer. Hope. Fragile. Terrifying. Real. And hope, he realized, was worth more than all the empires in the world. The whispers inside boardrooms grew sharper. By the 5th month of Adrien's every move orbiting Isabella Diaz, his empire was no longer untouchable. All this infatuation is making you reckless, his CFO declared in a meeting thick with tension. You're missing opportunities. Competitors smell blood. Adrien leaned back in his chair, expression cool but voice carrying steel. Then let them smell it. Numbers can be rebuilt. What I'm building now can't. The board exchanged anxious glances. No one dared press further, but the truth was clear. Adrien Blackwood, once the most disciplined predator of industry, was distracted. And all because of a waitress with fire in her eyes. Behind the headlines and corporate panic, Adrien's choices grew bolder. He stopped hosting the opulent galas that kept his name gilded. He rejected partnerships with elites who mocked Isabella. Privately, he began liquidating assets notorious for exploitation, the very ventures that had fueled his rise. A fortress built on bones can't last, he confessed quietly to his lawyer. I should have known it sooner. But each move had consequences. Investors murmured. Stock prices dipped. Competitors pounced. For the first time in years, Adrien's empire trembled, not from market volatility, but from the man's decision to put one woman's dignity above his own indestructible image. Isabella saw it slowly unfolding, but acceptance warred with fear. She'd warned him not to prove his love with diamonds, but this? Sacrificing pieces of his empire? She didn't know whether to admire him, or to panic that she was destroying the very thing keeping him afloat. You don't have to bleed for me, she told him one evening in her dim apartment, where he'd shown up again in nothing but a plain shirt and exhaustion. His lips curved in that tired, humble almost smile she'd started recognizing. Don't you see, Isabella? This isn't bleeding for you. This is cutting out the poison in me. Her breath caught. It was too much. Too heavy. She turned away, clutching the chipped counter for balance. She wanted to believe him. Her heart screamed to believe, but reality pressed harshly. Men made promises all the time. What if he changed today only to snap back tomorrow? The city was relentless. Paparazzi captured Adrien without lavish entourages, tabloids mocking. Has Blackwood gone broke chasing love? His so-called friends disappeared, whispering that he'd been bewitched into destruction. Socialites, once clamoring for his attention, now dismissed him with thin spite. And yet, strangely, Adrien seemed lighter with every piece he shed. Freed from masks, from appearances. Only Isabella weighed heavy because the harder he tried, the more she kept a wall between them. The wall cracked one night when crisis fell closer to home. Isabella's mother had a health scare, a sudden collapse that pulled Isabella into the hospital at 2 a.m., panic tracing her every breath. The waiting room was cold, fluorescent, filled with dread. Isabella sat alone, trembling, biting her lip until it bled. Then he arrived. Adrien. He hadn't been called, hadn't been told, yet somehow he was there, breathless from running through the hospital corridors, his tie crooked, his coat hastily thrown over his shoulders. When Isabella saw him, something in her broke. She rushed into his arms without thinking, sobs finally cracking past her pride. Adrien tightened his hold, whispering nothing more than, I'm here. I'm not leaving. Hours passed. The doctor finally emerged with guarded reassurance. Her mother would stabilize, but care would need to be delicate from here forward. Isabella sagged with relief, still wrapped in Adrien's arms, and for the first time she let herself lean on him without fight. It was in that hospital, amidst sterile walls and exhaustion, that she whispered, barely audible, maybe you're not a performance after all. Adrien lifted her chin gently, searching her eyes. I'm not for you. Never for you. The moment didn't erase years of pain or caution, but it planted something Isabella hadn't allowed herself to feel in decades, hope. Still, old wounds don't vanish with whispered promises. The next days, Isabella walled herself again, convincing herself she'd only broken down in panic. But Adrien pressed forward, with patience she could no longer dismiss as shallow charm. He showed up not with gifts but groceries. He rolled up his sleeves to cook in her tiny kitchen, burning rice twice, laughing at himself when smoke filled the apartment. He fixed a loose step on her fire escape ladder, cursing when the hammer slipped onto his thumb. He carried her mother's laundry to the laundromat. These weren't gestures a billionaire needed to make. They were clumsy, human, inconvenient, and they chipped away at Isabella's doubts. One evening, back in her apartment, she caught him kneeling by her mother's chair, telling her an exaggerated story about how he'd once stumbled through a Paris investor dinner, pronouncing a wine wrong and being laughed at for a week. Her mother laughed so hard tears rimmed her eyes, tears of joy Isabella hadn't seen in months. Watching Adrien there, smaller than she'd ever imagined him, Isabella felt her chest ache with something she no longer fought. Still, love is no fairy tale correction. It is war and peace all at once. Days later, Adrien met Isabella's fear again, the protective, wounded part of her that couldn't release history so easily. Men promise change until it stops suiting them, she murmured one night when he tried to reach for her. What happens when your empire calls again? When the boardroom asks you to be that ruthless man? Adrien's answer was quiet, resolute. Then I'll look them in the eye and tell them I already chose something more valuable than empires. And though Isabella didn't answer, her silence shifted. It was no longer rejection. It was consideration. Their story had moved beyond beginnings now, beyond flirtation, beyond battle. The city still mocked, corporations still sneered, socialites still whispered. But somewhere inside that storm, a billionaire had laid down his armor, and a waitress who swore she wouldn't break for anyone had begun to let him in. And though neither spoke it yet, both of them knew, what they were building together would either collapse under the world's weight, or rise into something unbelievable. No empire collapses in silence. Adrien's downfall began with whispers, then headlines, and soon it thundered through the city like a storm. Blackwood under fire. Stock plummets as Adrien prioritizes love over legacy. From boardroom to backstreet, did a waitress break the billionaire? The papers were merciless. Former allies ridiculed him. Rivals celebrated in schadenfreude, circling like vultures. Adrien, who once entered boardrooms as though wearing a crown, now walked into them carrying disdainful stares. At one meeting, his closest advisor slammed papers onto the mahogany table. You're bleeding capital. Our investors want reassurance. Your focus on this waitress has put us in jeopardy. For God's sake, Adrien, when will you wake up? Adrien's jaw tightened. For a moment, the old predator sparked in his eyes, the man who sharp-talked mergers and shredded opponents. But when he spoke, his voice was frighteningly calm. I am awake. Awake in a world bigger than balance sheets. The advisor stared at him as though he'd lost his mind, and maybe he had, at least by Wall Street's definition. But Adrien knew this. Every piece of his empire lost was a chain undone from his soul. Still, chains cut both ways. Back in her modest apartment, Isabella read those same headlines with unease. She saw the sneers, the way his name was dragged through mud with hers in every paragraph. A knot grew in her stomach. She hadn't asked him to destroy himself. She hadn't asked him to sacrifice every pillar of his history. When Adrien showed up at her door that night, weary, his shirt rumpled and his voice cracked, she finally said what had been crushing her chest. You can't do this for me, Adrien. You can't bleed your empire dry just to prove you care. That's not love, it's madness. Adrien stared at her, pain flashing across his face. Then what do you want from me? To go back to being the man who ruined you in order to save shareholders' confidence. Her arms crossed tightly. I want you to save yourself, Adrien. Not because of me. Because living two lives, yours and mine, will burn us both. Her words stung more than any financial loss. He stepped back, exhaling hard, a rare sound of defeat escaping his chest. For the first time, Adrien Blackwood looked utterly broken, not by rivals but by the woman he loved telling him he might lose himself trying to prove his worth. The following days unraveled quickly. Stock dropped further. One of his most loyal partners severed ties, citing personal instability. Paparazzi hounded Isabella endlessly, snapping photos of her mother as she walked into medical appointments, slapping cruel captions beneath them. Future mother-in-law of a fortune? Isabella fought to shield her mother from the noise, but within herself she began to wonder, could love survive this kind of war? Her doubts reached boiling point one night when she found Adrien waiting at her stoop. He looked hollow, like the empire had been sucked out of him. "I lost another contract today," he murmured. His usual steel was gone. "I can almost hear the walls of my empire tumbling." She touched the railing instead of him, steadying herself. "And is it worth it, Adrien?" His eyes glistened. The predator, the billionaire, the untouchable, all stripped away. "Yes. If what waits on the other side is you." Her throat tightened. Part of her wanted to reach for him, to believe the sincerity that she had begun to see in his brokenness. But the other part, the part welded by years of abandonment, poverty, pain, warned her, sincerity could vanish. Empires could collapse. And where would that leave her? The crescendo hit when Adrien was forced to face the board one last time. They staged a coup, dangling ultimatums like ropes. Leave her, reclaim discipline, rebuild the fortress, or step aside. Adrien stood there, towering at the head of the table, staring at the men who had once adored his ruthlessness. His voice was sandpaper, rough but unwavering. "You want a king drunk on greed? Find another. I'll bleed the empire before I betray the one person who saw me as more than this." Gasps rattled the room. Allies scowled. Rivals smirked in triumph. Adrien Blackwood, the powerhouse, walked out. Not with fanfare but with silence, his empire behind him, his heart bare ahead. When the news broke, Isabella felt the floor beneath her tremble. She knew then that Adrien had done it. He had chosen. Not wealth, not boardrooms, not glass towers. He had chosen her, or at least the chance of her. And that terrified her more than anything. Because when someone laid down kingdoms at your feet, the weight wasn't just theirs anymore. It became yours. Responsibility. Oh, a chance too big to hold casually. That night Adrien appeared at her door again, and Isabella opened it with a heart at war. He looked nothing like the billionaire she had first met at the Italian restaurant. He was raw, stripped down, his fortress burned behind him. "All I have left is you," he whispered. Her eyes filled, her pulse raced, but her voice, though trembling, answered with steel. "Then don't lose yourself, Adrien. Because I fell for the man who dared to sit in a diner booth and drink coffee with me, not the one tumbling out of desperation." Silence hung heavy. Their love stood at the edge of a cliff. Would she step with him into the unknown? Or let him fall silently, leaving both their worlds broken? The morning after Adrien's empire crumbled, the city buzzed with gossip thicker than smog. Every television carried his name plastered in bold. Blackwood resigns. From billionaire to bust. Love or folly? How a waitress toppled an empire. Isabella unplugged the television in her modest apartment after her mother gasped at the cruel headlines. She tried to stay composed, but guilt tugged at every part of her. Because she knew, with or without her asking, Adrien had set fire to everything for her. And what haunted her most was the fear she couldn't return that kind of devotion. When Adrien came to her door that night, Isabella hesitated before opening it. Part of her wanted to pretend she wasn't home, to shut the world out. But another part, quieter but stronger, couldn't leave him outside in his ruin. He stood there not in designer suits but in plain jeans and a jacket that looked foreign on his powerful frame. No chauffeurs, no entourage. Just Adrien, human, vulnerable, stripped bare by choice. "They took everything," he admitted softly as he stepped inside. "The towers, the partners, the contracts. My name feels more toxic today than alcohol on fire." Her chest clenched. "So why come here? Why not drown in comfort somewhere hidden?" Adrien's eyes found hers, raw but unwavering. "Because if I lost everything and didn't come to you, then it would mean none of it was worth losing in the first place." Those words cracked the ice around her ribs. Yet instead of falling into his arms, she walked into the kitchen, needing distance. "Do you hear yourself, Adrien? I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask you to burn it all down. And now I'm supposed to shoulder being the woman blamed for killing a kingdom." Her voice trembled, exposing her own fear. Not just fear of the press, of the sneers, of poverty creeping back into her life. But fear of love itself, of letting someone in fully, only to be abandoned once more like her father had left, like poverty had swallowed years of her youth. Adrien followed, standing in the narrow kitchen where the fridge hummed and cracked tiles bore witness to their battle. Then don't shoulder it alone. Let me. Because what I'm learning, Isabella, is that empires mean nothing if you have no one beside you in the dark. Her throat tightened, and for long moments she couldn't answer. Days rolled forward messily. The tabloids mocked. Strangers shouted insults in the street. Adrien's former colleagues cut ties fiercely. People he'd thought loyal scurried away like rats fleeing a sinking ship. He, once a king of opulence, now spent mornings cooking Isabella's mother breakfast eggs that ended up half-scorched, afternoons hauling grocery bags, evenings folding laundry poorly but sincerely. He looked ridiculous, half-billionaire muscle, half-clumsy domestic partner, and yet Isabella began seeing something miraculous. This man was learning humility in real time. Without his empire, Adrien was awkward, unpolished, struggling, but true. And for Isabella, who valued dignity above diamonds, this truth sang louder than tabloids ever could. Their quiet, fragile world began to feel like a sanctuary. Until reality pushed in once more. One afternoon Isabella sat across from Adrien at her tiny kitchen table. "Do you regret it yet?" she asked bluntly. "Destroying my empire?" He smirked faintly. "Every morning when I burn the coffee, I wonder if I was insane. But then I look at you, and I know I'd set fire to bigger empires if it meant reaching this table again." She exhaled sharply, torn. "Don't say things like that. You make it sound so easy. But you don't understand. I want to love you, Adrien. But I don't know if I can. Not with all the ashes you carry. Not with the guilt I feel for being the reason it's gone." It was the rawest confession she had given him yet. He leaned forward, his tone earnest. "Then don't love me for what I've lost. Love me for who I'm becoming. And if you can't yet, then let me prove it until you can." Her silence wasn't a no this time. It was a maybe muffled by fear. And then came the test no empire could prepare them for. A rival billionaire, one who had long envied Adrien's empire, appeared on every channel, spreading venom. This is what happens when love blinds a man. He falls into ruin. Adrien Blackwood? He doesn't belong in the market anymore. He belongs in the gutter with his little adventure. The cruelty was brutal. Even Isabella's co-workers repeated it. "So you really are the downfall of Blackwood, huh?" one sneered during a cafe shift. She fled to the restroom, tears flooding despite her best effort. And when she emerged, Adrien was waiting outside, having heard the words. He gently cupped her face, ignoring the stares, his voice soft enough only she could hear. "Let them talk, Isabella. Let them scream, downfall. They don't know it's the beginning." She stared at him, heart pounding with terror and hope colliding. Could ruin really be a beginning? Could this unbelievable love story possibly survive a world determined to end it? That night, as they lay on opposite sides of her small bed, Isabella whispered into the dark, almost as if confessing to herself. "I want to believe you, Adrien. God help me, I'm starting to." Adrien's eyes opened in the shadows, his whisper catching hers. "Then let me spend every day proving that belief right." And though she didn't answer aloud, her silence finally felt less like rejection, and more like surrender waiting to be born. Love, Isabella discovered, isn't tested most in moments of tenderness. It's tested in storms, when outside voices claw for blood, when the past comes pounding on the door demanding to be let back in. For weeks, she and Adrien tried to find rhythm within the chaos. Their days became humble, ordinary. Grocery runs, meals eaten on chipped plates, laughter stolen between exhaustion. For Isabella it was quietly surreal. A man who once dropped sums larger than her apartment lease on a single wine bottle now carried her grocery bags down cracked sidewalks without complaint. It should have been unbelievable. And yet here it was, true. But storms never rest when empires fall. One evening, as Isabella cleaned up after dinner, Adrien's phone buzzed again and again. Old contacts, the numbers of men and women who had abandoned him when his name became toxic, now lingered like shadows. At first he ignored them. But eventually, perhaps from habit, perhaps curiosity, he picked up. The voice was venom-wearing silk. "Robert Cale, Adrien's most dangerous rival. Always knew you'd slip," Cale drawled. "And here you are, crawling in kitchens with a waitress. Do you really think you'll rebuild anything like this? Look at you, Adrien. You're pathetic." Adrien's jaw clenched, fire flashing inside him. Old instincts screamed to battle to rip Cale apart. But then his eyes lifted. He saw Isabella in the doorway, frozen by the words she overheard. Something in her gaze shifted. Not trust, not hope. Fear. Later, when she confronted him, her voice shook. That's what the world will always call me, Adrien. A waitress. Your ruin. How long until you start believing them again? Adrien reached for her. Never. Never, Isabella. But her voice was sharp, breaking. Don't you see? Your downfall isn't just about you. It bleeds on me. Every headline, every insult, every man like Cale, they burn me too. Her eyes filled. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to take it anymore. Her words stabbed deeper than betrayal. Because Isabella wasn't lashing out with anger, she was trembling with truth. She'd endured poverty, illness, loneliness, but now she was being dragged through the furnace of Adrien's ruined empire, blamed for sins she never committed. And in the cruelest twist, she feared she might become exactly what the world accused her of, his weakness. That fear festered until the breaking point. One night, as snow blanketed the streets in silence, Isabella sat across from Adrien at her kitchen table. Her face was pale but resolute. I can't do this anymore. Adrien's chest seized. What do you mean? I mean us, she whispered, forcing herself to look directly at him. I love my mother too much to drag her through this destruction any further. I fought too long to let the world bury me alive for your choices. You say you love me and maybe you do. But it comes with fire, Adrien. And I'm not sure I can keep standing in the flames. His hand slammed the table, not in anger, but desperation. Don't walk away. Don't let them win. Don't let men like Cale be right about me, about us. Her lips trembled. This isn't about them being right. It's about whether I can live with myself while being scorched by your world. And right now, I can't. The silence that followed was a tomb. Adrien's throat burned with 1,000 words unsaid. He wanted to scream that he'd give up more, that he'd crawl if she asked. But he saw it, the steel resolve in her eyes that came from years of survival. She had chosen battles, and in this moment she chose retreat. Goodbye, Adrien, she whispered. And then she walked out, snow crunching under her boots, leaving Adrien inside the apartment that still smelled faintly of garlic bread and heartbreak. The next weeks were a blur of desolation. Adrien wandered the city alone, stripped even of her laughter, her fire. He drank bitter coffee at their diner booth with emptiness sitting across from him. He tried calling, writing, letters filled with desperation and sincerity, but her responses never came. Isabella buried herself in work again, silencing her heart's ache with labor and duty. But pain has a strange way of forging clarity. Adrien realized in that ice-cold loneliness that proving himself to her wasn't about grand sacrifices or public battles. It was about persistence, about continuing to transform when she wasn't watching. To change not because love demanded reward, but because the man he'd become couldn't return to who he was. So he did it, quietly. He worked anonymously with small charities, rebuilding without his name attached. He helped fund Isabella's cafe from the shadows so they could pay her fairly again, without her knowing the source. He swallowed scorn and insults from rivals without snapping. Slowly, piece by piece, Adrien rebuilt, not an empire but a self-worth existing. And though Isabella told herself she was done, she began hearing the whispers. Customers mentioning the mysterious Blackwood donations to community centers. Her mother confessing with misty eyes that Adrien had still been checking in, sending letters she had kept hidden. Isabella's anger warred with something else, something she hated admitting. Oh, because maybe, just maybe, the man she left wasn't a performance after all. 3 months passed without them. For Isabella, the first weeks were a blur of numbness, her determination forcing her forward even as her chest carried hollowness that wouldn't quiet. She woke, worked shifts, cared for her mother. Routine became her shield. If she focused enough on chores, maybe she could drown the echoes of his voice saying all I have left is you. But silence has a way of whispering truths louder than chaos. Some nights she caught herself pausing at her shabby kitchen table, imagining him across from her again, mangling the rice he always overcooked. Other nights, when William Cale appeared on the news gloating about Blackwood's ruin, her heart clenched violently, not out of triumph, but anger on Adrien's behalf. Meanwhile Adrien, stripped of empire but not of resolve, doubled down on rebuilding quietly. Not wealth. Not skyscrapers. Himself. He'd sworn to prove to her that his change was real, even if she never looked his way again. So he threw himself into serving. The man once photographed stepping off private jets began showing up at half-forgotten neighborhoods, bringing not announcements, not headlines, but sleeves rolled up to hammer nails at shelters. He funded scholarships for students his old acquisitions had hurt. At food banks, people recognized him at first with disbelief, then with awe, the billionaire serving ladles of soup in rolled-up shirt sleeves. And every time someone tried to thank him publicly, he stopped them with the same words, "Don't put my name on this. It isn't about me." He thought Isabella might never hear of it. But fate has a way of bringing truth to light. One chilly evening, Isabella was leaving the corner cafe when she heard two mothers gossiping nearby. "Do you believe it? Adrien Blackwood, yes, him, the billionaire. He's been volunteering at the shelter on 12th Street for weeks. Built a whole wing for veterans too. Wouldn't even let them name it after him." Isabella froze mid-step, her heart pounding. Later she saw more signs. Neighbors whispered that mysterious donations had kept their community center alive. Her mother confessed sheepishly, "He made sure the clinic kept our bills from piling. Quietly. Never once asked to see you." At first, anger flared. Was this persistence another trap? But the stories revealed something different. No cameras. No glory. No performance. He was living the change even without her watching. And then came the night she couldn't avoid facing him. Isabella had volunteered to help at the very same shelter the mothers mentioned, believing she could separate service from sentiment. But as soon as she walked in she heard it. His voice, warm and unpolished, laughing with a group of children playing nearby. Adrien Blackwood, once king of glass towers, was kneeling on the floor, helping a little boy assemble a puzzle. His sleeves rolled up, hair disheveled, sneakers scuffed. He looked more alive than she had ever seen him. For a moment, Isabella couldn't breathe. He looked up, perhaps sensing the weight of her gaze. When his eyes met hers, silence fell between them louder than the noise of the shelter. His lips parted slightly as though her presence was an impossible vision. She turned instinctively to leave, but a small hand tugged hers, a little girl from the shelter. "Stay," the child whispered innocently. "He's nice." Her throat tightened painfully. Not because of the child's words, but because of the undeniable proof reflected in every detail around her. Adrien was different. Not pretending. Not performing. Changed. Truly. Later, when she finally found herself sitting across from him at a folding table, the tension was almost unbearable. He spoke first, his voice low. "I didn't come here hoping you'd find me." She nodded faintly. "I know. That's how I know it's real. They didn't embrace then. They didn't confess. It was too soon, too fragile. But something undeniable happened. The walls she'd built started to crumble, piece by piece. In the following weeks, their paths crossed more often by fate than intention. At the shelter, at the clinic, at the community center where he funded after-school programs anonymously. Each time, Isabella saw more evidence. This wasn't a man chasing headlines or begging for her return. This was a man transformed. And watching him, Isabella began to transform too. One night she walked home, heart conflicted, her mother's words echoing. "Some men change because they want applause. Others change because they can't bear not to. Figure out which one he is, I say." She knew the answer now. Adrien wasn't waiting for her anymore. He was simply choosing daily to be better. And that, paradoxically, was the very proof she demanded all along. The choice was hers now, not whether he deserved a second chance but whether she was brave enough to take it. And that choice loomed heavier, sharper, and more terrifying than any insult the world had hurled at her. Snow fell heavier than usual that February night, blanketing the streets in quiet. Isabella walked down 12th Street with her coat pulled tight, her boots crunching through the frost. She had just finished a late shift helping at the shelter and knew Adrien was still inside. She had avoided him again, leaving early, but the tug in her chest grew unbearable. Each day she fought it, each day her resolve split wider. Fact was fact, she didn't doubt him anymore. She had proof of his transformation. The question was whether she could accept his love without the ghosts of her wounds choking her. When she reached the corner, she saw him exiting the shelter with a small boy asleep on his shoulder. Adrien smiled tiredly at the child's chatter before handing him gently to his mother. No cameras, no performance. Just Adrien human. Isabella froze, her breath catching painfully. She knew she couldn't run anymore. That night, in her kitchen where the fridge hummed and her mother dozed in the other room, Adrien sat across from her for the first real conversation they'd had alone in months. "Why didn't you tell me?" Isabella asked softly, her hands twisting together. "About the things you've been doing. The donations. The work. Why hide them?" "Because I wasn't doing them for applause," Adrien said, his voice tired but steady. "Not even for you. I was doing them because I couldn't live being the man I used to be. Whether you ever look at me again, Isabella, I can't go back. That life disgusts me now." Tears blurred her vision. "I left you because I thought you'd never change. I left because I couldn't risk loving someone who would destroy me by returning to who he was. And did I?" His rough whisper nearly broke her. She shook her head slowly. "No, you didn't." Silence stretched out, heavy, but her heart knew it was time to shatter it. 4 months she had fought against the current. Now she had to either drown or finally allow herself to float again. "I'm scared," she admitted at last, her voice cracking. "I'm scared of loving you. Because if you leave, if you falter, if tomorrow I lose you the way I lost everything else in my past, Adrien, it will destroy me." Adrien leaned forward, his hands shaking as they cupped hers. "Then let me spend every day making sure you never have to face that fear alone again. I can't erase the world's cruelty, Isabella. But I'll fight it beside you. Because losing my wealth showed me the only treasure I needed was you." Her chest shuddered, the last of her defenses crumbling. For the first time she didn't pull away from his touch. She held his hands tightly, her tears falling not in anger this time, but in surrender. And for the first time since the night she left him in snow, she whispered words she had buried for too long. "I never stopped loving you." Adrien's breath caught sharply, his eyes closing as relief crashed into him. He pulled her into his arms as if saving himself from drowning. She pressed her face into his chest, inhaling the scent of simple soap and dust instead of cologne and boardrooms. It was the scent of the man he had become. Later that night, in that modest apartment, their future began. Not with fairy tale fanfare. Not with expensive vows or limousines. But with a quiet promise whispered between two broken people finally allowing themselves to heal together. The world didn't approve. Tabloids sneered louder than ever when they learned Isabella had taken Adrien back. "The waitress who ruined and resurrected Blackwood," screamed the headlines. But Isabella no longer trembled. Because she finally understood something the gossip mills never could. Power wasn't in being feared or worshipped. Power was sitting at a chipped kitchen table, holding the hand of the one who had proven themselves not with wealth, but with change. Time moved into brighter rhythms after that. Adrien rebuilt, not skyscrapers, not empires, but reputation through service. Slowly, cautiously, some communities forgave. Slowly, cautiously, Isabella allowed herself to build dreams again. When spring came, Adrien knelt before Isabella on the very street corner where she had once walked away from him. No cameras, no diamonds, no public glory. Just him, trembling, holding out a small, modest ring. "I don't have empires left to give you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Only myself. Will you marry me, not as Adrien Blackwood the billionaire, but as Adrien the man who will fight every day to be worthy of you?" Isabella's tears spilled freely as she whispered yes. Not because of money. Not because of power. But because, despite the flames, their love had survived. And that was the unbelievable part. Not that a waitress married a millionaire. But that wealth couldn't keep them apart, and ruin couldn't stop them. Their wedding wasn't the spectacle the world expected. There were no towers of champagne, no string quartets flown in from Europe, no parade of politicians and socialites. Instead, the ceremony was held at a restored community center, the very same building Adrien had helped rebuild after years of neglect. The walls were decorated with hand-painted banners from the children who played there. Flowers were simple, donated from neighbors. The music was nothing more than a single violin played by one of Isabella's students from the after-school program. And yet, to Adrien, it was the most beautiful event of his life. Because the woman walking toward him was not another heiress trading titles or another actress clawing for headlines. She was Isabella Diaz, the waitress who had seen through every layer of his empire and chosen, finally, the man beneath it all. As vows were spoken, Adrien's voice shook more than when he defended billions in contracts. I built castles of glass and thought they made me invincible. But it was you, Isabella, who shattered them and showed me myself. I promised to spend every day earning the love I never deserved until I met you. Isabella, eyes shining, answered with words that silenced even the skeptics present. You thought I taught you to change, but Adrien, you taught me to believe. You showed me that sometimes love isn't about safety, it's about courage. And for that, I give you my heart, unafraid this time. When they kissed, applause rose not from paparazzi but from neighbors, friends, children, and mothers whose lives Adrien had touched since his fall. Many of them knew what it meant. This wasn't the marriage of an heiress and a king. This was redemption sealed in vows. Afterward, the reception spilled joyfully into the streets. Adrien laughed as he danced with Isabella to clumsy music played from an old speaker. She wore a modest lace dress, nothing extravagant, yet she looked like royalty in his arms. And in that laughter, that simple joy, lay a truth both of them finally understood. They had rebuilt not wealth but love. The headlines the next day still sneered. Billionaire marries waitress. Society's fall from grace reaches aisle. But something new also appeared. Voices of admiration, voices of people who'd seen for themselves what Adrien had become. The same communities who once cursed his name now defended it, speaking of clinics, scholarships, shelters. Slowly, cautiously, the narrative began to change, not because he demanded it but because he'd earned it. In the years that followed, Adrien and Isabella's story became legend, not to the elite, but to those who had once felt discarded. Their foundation grew, not funded by selfish pride but by service. Adrien remained firm. No tower bore his name, no gala re-narrated his past. Everything was built under the banner of dignity, for the people who had once been crushed by men like him. And Isabella? She thrived alongside him. No longer a waitress, no longer mocked in tabloids, she became the heart of their shared work. Mentoring young women, reminding them of their worth when the world tried to deny it. She carried herself not as the wife of Adrien Blackwood, but as Isabella Diaz, the woman who proved love and dignity could break down walls taller than skyscrapers. At night, when the world finally stilled, the two of them often returned to their beginnings. They sat together in a rickety diner booth, drinking cheap coffee, smiling at how extraordinary ordinary could feel. One evening, Adrien squeezed her hand across the table. Do you ever regret it? Choosing me through everything even when I broke. Isabella smiled, eyes softened by years of fire and forgiveness. No. Because love was never about who you were when we began, it was about who you chose to become. And with that, their story closed, not with glittering towers reclaimed or reputations shiny again, but with something much stronger. Love proven through sacrifice, dignity defended, redemption chosen daily. To the world it would always sound unbelievable. But for Adrien and Isabella, it was simply theirs, the love that burned empires to ashes and built something real in their place.